Two women are lying in the sand, exactly where they were buried thousands of years ago. Their bodies never decayed the way bodies are supposed to. And when scientists finally extracted their DNA and ran it against every population database on Earth, every living human group, every ancient sample ever sequenced, nothing matched. Not a close match. Not a distant match. No match at all. These two women belong to no population currently walking the planet. They are not the ancestors of the people who live in that same desert today. They are not the ancestors of anyone, anywhere, that we have found. They are a dead end. A branch of the human family tree that grew, flourished, and then simply stopped, leaving almost nothing behind except two bodies in the sand and a genetic signature nobody could explain. This is not a plot twist in a novel. This is a real scientific finding published in one of the most respected journals on Earth. And it forces a question that most of us have never had to seriously ask. How many entire branches of humanity have existed, lived full lives, and vanished so completely that we don't even have a name for them? To understand how strange this discovery really is, you have to start with a place most people think they already understand, and you'd be wrong. Picture the Sahara. Most people picture exactly one thing, an ocean of sand, punctuated by nothing. Hostile to almost all life, the definition of emptiness. That image is accurate today. It was not always accurate. For thousands of years, during a period climate scientists call the African humid period, the Sahara was the opposite of a desert. It was a green, thriving savanna. Lakes, rivers, grasslands, forests, herds of animals, and human communities living exactly the kind of settled, resource-rich life you'd expect near any fertile water source. The same coordinates that today represent one of the most punishing environments on the planet were, for a stretch of deep prehistory, something closer to paradise. Then the rains stopped. Not overnight, but relentlessly. The lakes shrank, the rivers dried, the grasslands turned to dust, and everything that had lived there, every community, every herd, every human face that had once looked up at those stars was buried under sediment and sand and silence. But something survived that shouldn't have. Not stone, not tools, something far more fragile and far more informative. DNA. In what is now southwestern Libya, there's a rock formation called Takarkori. Inside it, archaeologists working with Sapienza University of Rome uncovered the remains of a small community, 15 women and children, naturally mummified by the arid conditions, buried roughly 7,000 years ago. For years, these remains sat cataloged in storage, waiting for a technology that didn't exist yet to catch up with the questions their bones were quietly holding. That technology finally arrived. Researchers extracted DNA from the teeth and leg bones of two of the mummified women, and what came back didn't confirm anything anyone expected. It dismantled it. For decades, the working assumption in archaeology was straightforward. During the Green Sahara period, the region would have functioned as a migration superhighway. Fertile land connecting North Africa to sub-Saharan Africa would naturally have encouraged movement, contact, mixing different groups, meeting, trading, intermarrying, exchanging genes as freely as they exchanged goods. It was a clean, logical model. It made sense on paper. The Takarkori women's DNA said otherwise. These two women were not genetically sub-Saharan. They weren't a blend of populations either. They belonged to a previously undocumented North African lineage one that had split off from sub-Saharan African populations roughly 50,000 years ago, and then, astonishingly, stayed separate. Not for a few centuries, not for a couple thousand years, for 50,000 years, while the Green Sahara sat right between two continents like an open door. This population never walked through it in either direction in any way that shows up in their genes. Scientists have a specific term for a population like this: a ghost population. It's not a poetic flourish, it's a precise designation. A ghost population is a group whose existence geneticists can mathematically infer, because faint traces of their DNA show up scattered through the genomes of living people today like a signal bouncing off something that should be there but has never actually been found. Researchers had detected exactly this kind of faint echo in modern North Africans for years, a shadow with no body, a whisper with no source. Until Takarkori, nobody had ever found the actual remains of the population producing that signal. Now they have. For the first time in the history of this research, a ghost population had a face. Two, actually. Sit with what that means for a second. Somewhere in the genome of some people living in North Africa today, there's a fragment tracing back to these two women. But the community itself, the language they spoke, the songs they might have sung, the names they gave their children, every social structure and belief system that made up their world, all of it is gone. Not preserved in some diminished form. Gone. The only reason we know they existed at all is because two women were mummified in exactly the right conditions, in exactly the right place, and modern sequencing technology finally became powerful enough to read what was left of them. The study was led by archaeogeneticist Nada Salem at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, one of the most respected ancient DNA research centers in the world, and published in Nature. Genomic analysis placed the split between this North African lineage and sub-Saharan populations at almost exactly the same moment that anatomically modern humans began their expansion out of Africa, roughly 50,000 years ago. It's arguably the single most consequential demographic event in the history of our species. And at exactly that moment, this specific lineage did something different. While the rest of humanity was fanning out across the planet, mixing, splitting, and eventually populating every continent, this group stayed, or was pushed back, or found itself boxed in by a landscape that looked open but functioned like a wall. We don't know which. What we know is that the divergence happened, and it held for 50,000 years without being erased by contact with the groups migrating around them. Here's where the story gets even more layered, because the Takarkori women weren't just cut off from sub-Saharan Africa. They were also untouched by the waves coming from the north. At the time these women were alive, the Neolithic Revolution was reshaping half the world. Farming populations from Anatolia were spreading through Europe and the Mediterranean, carrying agriculture, new tools, and new genes everywhere they went. That wave reached the Mediterranean coast. It reached the Nile Valley. By every reasonable expectation, it should have reached Takarkori too. It didn't, at least not genetically. Genomic analysis shows this group was neither replaced nor meaningfully absorbed by the incoming agricultural populations moving through the region during that period. They remained genetically untouched by one of the most transformative demographic shifts in human history, happening in their own backyard. And yet this is the detail that gets lost in most retellings of this discovery. These were not primitive people huddled in isolation, out of ignorance. We know they were pastoralists. They kept livestock. They herded cattle. That is not a simple accomplishment. Domesticating and managing herds requires planning, coordination, generational knowledge transfer, a genuine understanding of animal behavior, and a social structure capable of sustaining all of that over time. These were organized, capable, fully sophisticated human communities. Which raises an obvious question. If they were isolated enough that almost no outside genes got in, how did they end up herding cattle, one of the signature technologies of the very Neolithic wave that supposedly never reached them? This is arguably the single most important and most overlooked conclusion buried in the Takarkori research. The genetic evidence suggests these people adopted herding through cultural exchange, trade, contact, observation, shared knowledge rather than through migration and interbreeding with the groups who originated the practice. For decades, the standard model in archaeology has treated major innovations farming, herding, metallurgy, pottery, as things that spread primarily through population replacement. One group moves in, brings the innovation with them, and either displaces or genetically absorbs the people already living there. Technology and genes travel together. That's the textbook version. Takarkori breaks that model. It shows that an idea can cross a genetic boundary that people themselves never crossed. Knowledge can flow through trade and contact and simple curiosity, completely detached from intermarriage or genetic mixing. Someone, somewhere nearby, may have been the first to domesticate cattle. The Takarkori people learned the practice, but almost none of that neighboring population's DNA shows up in the Takarkori genome. The technique moved. The people, genetically speaking, did not. That single finding reshapes more than just this one population's story. It changes how we should think about cultural evolution across the ancient world in general. Change didn't always come from conquest or replacement. Sometimes it came from nothing more dramatic than curiosity and exchange between neighbors who otherwise kept mostly to themselves. For a long time, the standard model of human prehistory treated the interior of Africa, especially North Africa during this period, as something like a waypoint, a corridor people passed through on their way somewhere else, rather than a place people actually called home in any lasting, distinct sense. Takarkori says otherwise. North Africa wasn't a corridor. It was a home to a population with its own deep, independent history, its own genetic identity, and its own multi-thousand-year story, quietly running in parallel to the rest of human history without anyone outside that rock shelter ever knowing it was happening. Our research challenges previous assumptions about North African population history and highlights the existence of a deeply rooted and long isolated genetic lineage, is how Neda Salem put it. A sentence that sounds measured in the careful language of a published paper, but which is, underneath that restraint, a genuinely radical claim. It means the map we've been using to understand our own prehistory has an entire missing region on it, not a footnote. A missing population genetically coherent, culturally capable, and present for 50,000 years that no existing model had accounted for, which forces an uncomfortable follow-up question. How many others are there? The Takarkori discovery didn't happen in a vacuum. It arrived alongside another finding from a completely different part of the world that's quietly rewriting the same, broader story, what we assume ancient humans were capable of. Researchers working across China and Southeast Asia have documented what may be the oldest mummies ever found, a discovery published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, describing human remains preserved by slow smoke drying over fire, dating back roughly 10 to 12,000 years, and in some cases even further. For context, Egyptian mummification, the version most of us picture when we think of preserved ancient bodies, dates back around 4,500 years. The Chinchorro mummies of South America, long considered among the oldest deliberate mummification traditions, go back about 7,000 years. This pushes the timeline back by thousands of years further still, and the people doing it weren't part of any organized civilization in the way we usually define the term. No cities, no writing, no centralized government, hunter-gatherers. Researchers examined bone samples from 95 pre-Neolithic sites spread across southern China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and found a consistent pattern. Many skeletons were positioned in a tight fetal posture and showed clear evidence of prolonged smoke drying over fire before burial. This wasn't accidental preservation. It was a deliberate ritual, one requiring planning, community coordination, careful fire management, and a belief system about death sophisticated enough to produce a consistent tradition across an enormous geographic range. Smoking likely carried spiritual, religious, or cultural meanings that went far beyond simply slowing decay, said Xiao Chun Hung of the Australian National University, the study's lead author, and that's the detail worth sitting with. These weren't people with cities or written language, and yet they were engaging in elaborate, intentional mortuary practices, a relationship with death, a belief in something beyond the body, a desire to physically preserve the people they loved. Complexity, in other words, in exactly the place the old models assumed there would only be simplicity. Perhaps the most remarkable part, this tradition never fully ended. Versions of it persisted into the ethnographic record in the New Guinea highlands and parts of Australia, meaning that somewhere on Earth right now, living communities still practice a version of a mortuary tradition that stretches back roughly 12,000 years, through the end of the Ice Age, through the spread of agriculture, through colonization, through everything modernity has thrown at it. Return to the Libyan desert, because there's one more layer to the Takarkori story that rarely gets the attention it deserves, and it complicates the picture in a genuinely strange way. Researchers also detected Neanderthal DNA in the Takarkori individuals, roughly 10 times less than populations living outside Africa carry, but noticeably more than contemporary sub-Saharan Africans. Read that carefully, because on its face it doesn't add up. These women are genetically closer to sub-Saharan Africans than to any non-African population, and yet they carry more Neanderthal ancestry than sub-Saharan Africans do today. The most likely explanation: at some point, probably tens of thousands of years ago, the ancestors of the Takarkori lineage had limited contact with populations carrying Neanderthal ancestry, not enough to shift their overall genetic identity, but enough to leave a faint, permanent trace. A brief brush with a wider world before retreating back into isolation and carrying that small genetic echo with them across millennia, all the way to a rock shelter in Libya, all the way to a laboratory in Leipzig, thousands of years later. The greening of the Sahara only happened 15,000 years ago. Before that, it was a desert again, explained Professor Johannes Krauss, senior author of the study and director of the Max Planck Institute's Department of Archaeogenetics. So we actually don't know where they were hanging out between 50,000 years ago when they split from the southern African population, and 15,000 years ago. Read that gap again. 35,000 years. 35,000 years during which this lineage existed somewhere on the planet, surviving ice ages, surviving arid periods, surviving whatever the Pleistocene threw at them, and left no trace anywhere that science has yet managed to find. They were alive, they were reproducing, they had to be somewhere, and we simply don't know where. That gap should be unsettling in the most productive sense of the word. It means that even with every tool modern archaeogenetics has, ancient DNA extraction, radiocarbon dating, decades of excavation, increasingly powerful sequencing technology, our picture of human prehistory still has holes in it, large enough to swallow 35,000 years of an entire population's existence. The Takarkori lineage's long isolation reshapes assumptions about ancient human behavior, Salem noted. They were in a prime location for interaction, but chose, or were forced by environment, to stay separate. That second possibility is worth sitting with. Being forced by environment into isolation means that even a green, fertile Sahara wasn't the open highway it looked like from the outside. Wetlands on one side, rocky highlands on another, seasonal rivers acting as boundaries rather than bridges, a landscape that appeared connected but functioned on the ground as a patchwork of separate ecological pockets, each one capable of holding a human population in its own genetic bubble for tens of thousands of years. The paper also found that the Takarkori people are closely related to 15,000-year-old hunter-gatherers from Tafaralt Cave in Morocco, with both groups showing a similar genetic distance from sub-Saharan African populations, suggesting limited genetic interaction between North Africa and the rest of the continent during this entire stretch of time. which means North Africa during this period wasn't one homogeneous region gradually mixing with its neighbors. It held at least two distinct, deeply isolated lineages, the Tafaralt people of Morocco and the Takarkori people of Libya, separated from each other by distance and time, and both separated from sub-Saharan Africa by a genetic gulf that lasted tens of thousands of years. The old model pictured a corridor, one continuous path of human movement and mixing. The real picture looks more like an archipelago, scattered islands of genetically isolated human communities, separated not by ocean, but by terrain, climate, and the particular social dynamics of small ancient groups, each one running its own independent evolutionary story, and almost all of them vanishing without a trace, leaving nothing behind except a faint echo in the genomes of people alive right now. Here's the deeper question sitting underneath all of this. For a century, the dominant model of human progress has treated connectivity as the engine of advancement. Populations mixing, migrating, exchanging genes and ideas, driving each other forward. Isolation in that model is supposed to mean stagnation. Takarkori doesn't fit that model. These people were isolated, profoundly, genetically isolated, for 50,000 years. And they were not primitive. They herded cattle. They built cultural and mortuary traditions sophisticated enough to be culturally coherent across a demanding environment. They were organized, capable, and fully human in every sense that matters. Isolation didn't make them less advanced. And on the other side of the world, the smoke-dried mummies of Southeast Asia tell a nearly identical version of the same lesson. Hunter-gatherers, with no writing, no cities, no agriculture, produced mortuary rituals, sophisticated enough to survive 12,000 years and multiple continents. Complexity doesn't require the conditions we assume it requires. It shows up in places the old models never thought to look. What makes all of this even more remarkable is that it almost didn't survive to be discovered at all. Professor Krauss noted that it was genuinely surprising the genome sequencing worked at all, given how badly hot, arid climates tend to degrade genetic material. The Sahara is one of the most hostile environments on Earth for DNA preservation, and yet these two samples held together long enough in exactly the right conditions for the science to finally catch up with them, which raises the obvious, slightly uncomfortable question. What else is out there in equally hostile conditions that we simply haven't found yet, or haven't had the technology to read? The Arabian Peninsula, the Horn of Africa, the deserts of Central Asia, the permafrost stretches of Siberia. Every one of these regions could be holding its own version of a ghost population, a lineage that diverged tens of thousands of years ago, ran its own separate evolutionary experiment in total isolation, and vanished before ever reaching the present, leaving behind nothing but a faint statistical echo in someone else's genome. We are, by any honest measure, still early in our ability to even ask the right questions about this. The tools keep getting better, the samples keep getting older, and every time researchers think they've finally filled in the outline of the human story, the ground opens up again and reveals another gap nobody knew was there. Go back to where this started. Two women buried in a rock shelter in what is now one of the most unforgiving deserts on Earth, in a landscape that used to be green and fertile and full of life. They waited 7,000 years for the right technology, the right researchers, and the right laboratory to finally be able to hear what their bones and teeth had been quietly holding on to the entire time. Across the world, the ancestors of the Southeast Asian smoke-dried tradition waited 12,000 years for the same kind of attention. And somewhere else in a desert we haven't surveyed properly yet, in permafrost that hasn't thawed enough to be excavated, in an archive of bones sitting uncatalogued in a museum basement, there are almost certainly others still waiting. The human story most of us grew up with is a straight line: Africa, migration, mixing, progress, us. What Takarkori actually shows is something closer to a landscape scattered with islands, separate branches of humanity, running their own private histories in parallel, most of them ending in silence, all of them leaving behind nothing but the faintest trace in the DNA of people who have no idea that trace is even there. Two women, 50,000 years of separation, 35,000 years completely unaccounted for, and a question that no laboratory on Earth can currently answer. How many more of them are still out there, waiting for us to finally be ready to listen?